So we'll make a start. Welcome to this, the second in these public lectures for the Related to Public Life, hosted by Keenan Institute for Ethics, the Divinity School, and Trinity College for Arts and Sciences. I will get that down packed by the end of the series. Very, very good that you are here. Professor Mark Chase will introduce our guest speaker. Do say for those who are part of the class, you must wait for the victuals. I'm afraid the dinner will transpire by some magical means. Actually, it's already there. So at the end of the class, at the end of this session, we'll move over to 0013 and have our discussion. Those of you who are guests, extremely warm welcome, and we'll have the lecture and then time for questions until about, and we'll finish about 6:30. So, Mark.
Thanks, Luke. I'm Mark Chaves. I'm a sociologist, and I'm jointly appointed here at Duke in the Sociology Department, the Religion Department, and the Divinity School. And it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Jose Casanova. Professor Casanova is Professor of Sociology at Georgetown University, and he's Senior Fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Before going to Georgetown in 2008, he spent 20 years on the faculty of the New School for Social Research. Professor Casanova is the author of many articles and chapters, and he's lectured, held visiting appointments, and won honors around the world. His groundbreaking 1994 book, Public Religions in the Modern World, was an immediate blockbuster, and it would be difficult to overstate its influence on thinking about secularization and more broadly on thinking about religion's place in the modern world. The book clarified the ways that secularization has and has not occurred, and it established a way of thinking about how religions can be and are publicly influential, even in highly secular societies. The book's core thesis was that secular institutions have become increasingly separate from religious institutions and norms, and this is the sense in which secularization has occurred. But this institutional separation does not necessarily lead to religion's public marginalization any more than it necessarily leads to extinguished religious belief. This was insightful enough. But one of the distinctive features of Professor Casanova's work in that book and beyond that book is that he engages moral and theological as well as sociological questions about public religion. Like other social scientists, he asks what kinds of public religion are sociologically possible and likely in modern societies. But unlike most other social scientists, he also is bold enough to ask what kinds of public religion should be considered legitimate or illegitimate, desirable or undesirable. This part of Professor Casanova's intellectual agenda is very much in line with what I take to be a primary goal of Duke's Religion and Public Life initiative, to understand how religion might be both truly public and truly modern. So it's particularly meet and right that he's here in connection with this initiative. As it happens, I reviewed Professor Casanova's book in 1995. In that review, I said that the book is more penetrating and more compelling than any other recent work on the subject. 18 years later, those words are still true. So please join me in welcoming Jose Casanova, who will speak to us tonight on post-secularization, globalization, and poverty.
Thank you, Mark. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here, to have the chance to have a conversation around these very, very broad issues. I mean, post-secularization, globalization, and poverty in 40 minutes. I'll try to be brief. I'll try to be as kind of engaging as I can. I'll talk more about post-secularization, which I think is the more controversial issue, and not so much about globalization, which probably is, and much less about poverty, but I hope that we can have a conversation where those things come together. Post-secularization. I don't like the word post-secularization. I don't think that we are by any means in any phase of post-secularization. We are in a post-secular condition, which means a post-secularist one. when Habermas, the great theorist, European philosopher of secular modernity, talks of a post-secular society, he does not mean a society which is religious again. There is very evident, actually there is very little evidence of any religious revival in highly secularized Western European societies. East Germany, that was the evidence of forced secularization, which is probably the most secular society in the world. Over 51% of the population declared themselves atheists a decade ago. The number has not changed, perhaps has increased. There is no evidence whatsoever of any religious revival in East Germany. Very little evidence of any religious revival in highly secular Scandinavian societies. So in this respect, we should be careful of any discourse of desecularization of the world, as my colleague and friend Peter Berger is talking about. Here I actually agree with David Martin. We are not seeing secularization in reverse practically anywhere in the world, other than in places in which this forced secularization from above was linked to a very practicable or very questionable practice of radical authoritarian elites to basically take away ordinary people's understanding of their traditions. Like as in China, for instance, you see a revival of all kinds of religious traditions, but not precisely because this is evidence that humans are always religious, that we are homo religiosus, and therefore religion will come back eventually. I would not bet on it. I think that our condition today is one of truly both faith and unfaith as options. And this is, of course, the thesis of A Secular Age of Charles Taylor. That on the one hand, what I am very much for is a post-secularist condition in which we question the previous assumption that to be modern means to be secular and without religion. That to be modern means to leave religion behind, because religious is a pre-modern thing that eventually will disappear with modernity. Now, this was the core of the thesis of European secularization, and it's very much still an assumption among European, both social scientists, I would say, but especially ordinary people, that to be modern means to be secular. Now, this thesis has proven wrong. It is true that in Europe, modernization is associated with religious decline, and the evidence is overwhelming there. But everywhere else, around the world, you see a lot of conditions where modernization is not accompanied by religious decline, by secularization, but actually by religious growth and religious revival. This was, of course, always the case in the United States. As we know, at the time of independence, perhaps 20% of the population were church, belonged to churches. The majority were unchurched and only became affiliated later as part of the process of religious awakening, religious revivals, religious mobilization that was parallel with political democratic mobilization. So the phenomenological experience in the United States has been to become politically modern, mobilized, to become democratic, to become religious, to become individualist are one and the same thing. So the American experience associates modernization with democratization and with religious revival, religious growth. In Europe, the phenomenological experience of most Europeans is that religion was a thing of my past that I leave behind as I become modern and more democratic. The democratization of European societies after World War II is associated with very much a radical secularization. So the experience of becoming modern and becoming secular in Europe is one and the same. In America, this is not the case, and in much of the rest of the world, it is not the case. It was the case in China, because it was the argument that the Chinese elites made. To compete with Western colonialism, we need to get rid of all our traditions, folk religions, idolatries, superstitions, to become scientifically rational to compete with the Westerners. This was an argument that Chinese modernizers made. In India, the modernizing elites made the opposite argument. To fight British imperialism, we should mobilize religion. We should use religion as a resource. So religious mobilization in India is part of becoming modern. So it goes together with modernization. So people in India associate modernity with becoming religious, much like in the United States. That's why, for instance, we know that the people lie to the pollsters. And we know because of the research done by Mark and others, trying to prove that Americans, after all, are not so religious as they claim. They are much less religious. They only claim to be more religious. They claim to go to church, to pray more frequently than they do. But for me, the interesting question is, why do Americans lie, claiming to be more religious, unless they believe that to be a good American, that means to be a modern American, means to be religious? While in Europe, we know that they lie in the opposite direction. Even religious people, which we know go to church, when you ask them, are you religious? By God forbid, of course I'm not religious. I'm a modern secular European. What do you think? So it is very different phenomenological experience. The argument here would be modernization itself does not produce anything. It has to be mediated phenomenologically by some experience. Is it associated with freedom from a confessional obligation? And so the question that we need to ask is, if modernization does not explain Western European secularization, what explains it? And I would argue what explains it is deconfessionalization. It was because European peoples and societies and nations and states were all confessionalized in the 16th and 17th century. And the principle cuius regio eius religio, the religion of the ruler becomes the religion of the subjects. So it became an obligatory way of being a member of society. So you have the homogeneous Protestant confessionalization of Northern Europe, the homogeneous Catholic confessionalization of Southern Europe, and in between three biconfessional societies, Holland, Germany and Switzerland, that remained biconfessional till the 1960s. I used to work in a village in der Pfalz in Germany, in which everybody was Catholic. There was only one Protestant woman who had married a Catholic man. The next village was all Protestant, and there was only a Catholic man who had married a Protestant woman. And this had been like that for 300 years. Of course, the 60s modernization changed this confessionalization, and so it collapsed. Holland, the confessional pillars collapsed in the 60s. So what happened in Europe was people left the churches, became unchurched, because they view being members of the church as a kind of a forced, obligatory identity that was given to them by the state, by the nation. So you have a process of deconfessionalization of the state, of the nation, of individuals in Europe, that you don't have it in the United States because there was no previous confessionalization. When we say that only 20% of the population at the time of independence were members of the church, means that even the colonial established churches were not churches in the sociological sense of the term of obligatory territorial institutions for the whole colony, because only the elites belonged to the church. The ordinary people did not belong to the Congregational Church. The ordinary people did not belong to the Anglican Church in the southern states. So it was not really a confessional church the way every European church was a confessional church obligatory for every individual. So again, the point is, Europeans associate modernization with individual freedoms, and the most important of them is liberating oneself from the confessional identity of the church. We go into the 60s, the counterculture, and how different the countercultures were in the United States and in America. So the point now, are we then post-secular? Well, only post-secular if we have abandoned the secularist assumption that to be modern means necessarily to become religious. And then we accept that, no, it's simply a historical particular transformation of European societies for very specific historical reasons. And somewhere else, modernization is accompanied by very different processes of religious transformation, mobilization, etc. In fact, I would argue in the last 20 years, we have, all of us working in the field of religion, have to radically change our fundamental assumptions. When I both studied theology in the 60s in Germany, and when I studied sociology in the 70s in the United States, it was taken for granted. All the theories, social scientific theories of religion take for granted that religion is a very primitive thing. So you have a genealogical theory of religion. When does religion emerge in the history of humanity? The argument is it emerges in the beginning of humanity for some strange reason, and you have to explain how this error somehow emerges. And then you have to develop a theory of what the telos of this very primitive traditional thing is going to be. And the assumption was that the more modern, the less room there is for religion. Now, in the last 20 years, thanks to the anthropologists and religious studies people, we have now a completely reverse understanding that our category of religion, the way we use it when we talk of the free exercise of religion, is simply something that anybody can define whatever religion is, that is a very modern concept, and therefore, rather than being a very traditional thing that disappears, it's actually something that emerges with modernity. And as the Western colonial expansion was globalized, and here is where we talk about globalization, the interesting thing is that the religious-secular divide, which is a unique theological Christian Western category. I say Western because it does not appear in Byzantine Christianity. It was Augustine who translated both concepts. Seculum, that was simply a non-theological concept. Per secula seculorum only means forever and ever. It's like aeon in Greek, has no theological meaning originally. And religio, which is the Latin word, pre-axial word of religio, which in Varro, that we only know through Augustine's writing, means precisely the division of theologia naturalis, cosmology, so theologia mythica, the gods of the Olympus, and theologia politica, or the god of the city, what you call political theology. These three versions, Augustine says, none of them are religion at all. There is only the vera religioni of true religion, turning religion into a category of axial truth that distinguishes true religion from false religion or idolatry, which is, of course, what Assmann has called the Mosaic distinction between true religion and false religion. It was this concept that was the core of all the axial systems until modernity, when precisely the free exercise of religion makes all religions equal and cannot separate which religions are false, which religions are true. So it is, paradoxically, it is actually what Taylor calls the immanent frame that allows the possibility of a new category of religion that is not anymore based upon true and false religion, upon, if you wish, traditional modern, but anything goes. And the condition, the post-secular condition we find ourselves today, you go to any global city, and it is the living together, the basically side by side of all religions of humanity, from the most primitive to the most postmodern, all of them having to compete with one another, and all of them claiming to be true, because ultimately the principle of freedom of religion is not based on the objective truth of the religions, but on the right of the individuals to say, this is my religion, this is my truth. So this is first. The mother individual principle of religious freedom basically determines, the individual determines the truth of the religion, not the objective nature of the religion. And so, so each individual decides which religion is true for the individual. Second, the secular state, by definition, tries to avoid having to be a theological actor, decide this is true religion, this is false religion, and so it also tends towards denominational equality of all religions, although, of course, most states cannot avoid having to make all kinds of court decisions, even in the United States. Still, states are continuously forced to decide which activities are protected or are not protected by the free exercise or by religious freedom. And third, because in our global condition is where we'll enter with globalization now. Our global condition is one in which precisely all religions of the world confront one another with the claims of being the true religion. Now, this was one of the theses of secularization. This was Peter Berger's famous thesis, that the very multiplicity of religions leads to relativism into secularization. This is a thesis which makes sense cognitively in terms of philosophical truths, but sociologically we see that this is not true. American society is one of the most pluralistic religious societies in the world, but very few, not relativistic at all. India is probably the other case of the most pluralistic religious society in the world, not relativistic at all. European societies are highly secular, but not relativistic either. It's not because they are relativistic have become secular, because they are still very much convinced that the secular truth has replaced the old religious truth. So they are not relativistic at all. So the whole notion of relativism is pluralism, yes, but not necessarily relativism. Religious pluralism precisely can be combined with the acceptance of the claims of truth of all religions. And this is, I think, the condition, the global condition we find ourselves today, what I will call global denominationalism. In the same way that we have a denominational system in the United States, in which the state does not determine the religion of the citizens, and does not even ask the citizens which religion they have. The state has no right to ask the religion of its subjects. But citizens constantly ask each other, which religion are you? And basically what they say, I am a Baptist, I am a Methodist, I am a Jew, I am a Muslim. And this is simply a denominational identity. I denominate myself such, and you accept my denomination. It's a process of mutual recognition in civil society without a state intervention. And you could argue this is the condition which we find ourselves today of global denominationalism, in which all the religions of the world have to somehow both live together and compete with one another and recognize one another, sometimes through bloody conflicts, it happens, but sometimes through precisely a process of mutual recognition of their claims, and each of them claims to be unique, particular, claiming to be the right to be different, and at the same time somehow having a universal message for all of humanity. So each religion today claims to be both particular and universal. And this is very much the really condition of globalization. Now, globalization, of course, we must distinguish between what we could call the age of globalization and historical process of globalization. The age of globalization, we could say, really began 30 years ago, when people even coined the term globalization. In the 1970s, for the first time, people talk of globalization, a few people at first. Roland Robertson claims to have invented the term, but other people question his claims. In the 80s, it became more extended among economists and social scientists. In the 90s, it became a buzzword, and now everybody uses it. But what does it mean? Well, globalization simply means, obviously, increase global connectivity so that all the peoples of the world, all societies somehow interconnected somehow. And of course, a question of degree, not of absolute. But basically, there is a much greater interconnectivity today than 50 years ago. And global consciousness. And I think that is very important. It's not interconnectivity per se, but global consciousness. And the question is, when does the process of global interconnectivity begins and the process of global consciousness begin? And obviously, if you want to date the beginning of globalization, by definition, this is impossible. There's no way you can say globalization began so and so. Or you could actually say globalization, the first phase, is when Homo sapiens left Africa some 50,000 years ago and began populating the globe. This is the first phase of globalization. But of course it happened without really connectivity. Actually it was disconnection, right? Everybody going in different directions and losing connectivity, but then creating the conditions for the later connectivity and no global consciousness whatsoever. Only now today through DNA and other technologies we can reconstruct how this process happened. So in terms of global connectivity, it's a very old as human history. Now, global consciousness, we could say, emerges for the first time when humans become aware of their universal humanity. When they begin to talk of one single God for all humanity, or global ethics for all humanity, or global logic for all humanity, there is no more Confucian Chinese ethics versus non-Confucian Chinese. No, Confucius argues those are human ethics for all humans, not only for Chinese. And the same goes for Buddha, and the same goes for Socrates, and the same goes for the Old Testament prophets that talk of Yahweh not only as the God of Israel, but the God of all humanity and the God of history. Now, it just happened that those four people I talked were contemporaries. This is what is called the axial age. The moment when humans become aware of their global humanity and develop some anticipation in the form of either a global religious message or a global ethic or a global logic. And in this respect, religions have been carriers of globalization thereafter. Christianity begins in Palestine, but then spreads, and Buddhism spreads, and Islam spreads, but all of them are still at first embedded within worldly regimes. Their oikumene is still geographically restricted, it's not yet global. The Pope may have claimed to speak always urbi et orbe, to the city and to the globe, this orbis means. But of course this only became truth, a reality, after World War II, when Radio Vatican could spread the word of the Pope to all people, and he himself began to address the letters not only to Catholics but all humans. Then you could say you have the Catholic Church becoming for the first time truly globally conscious. Of course, global Catholicism began much earlier. In fact, the first phase of globalization with the colonial expansion, the age of discoveries, was the golden age of Catholic global missions. The Jesuits, 20 years after their foundation, were all over the globe. They were in India, they were in China, in Japan, in Ethiopia, in Paraguay, in Maryland, in Russia. And the interesting, they were global, but they were also local. They were native. They were localizers. They became Brahmins in India, nobile, became Mandarins in China, ricci. They became Indians in Paraguay. They became slave owners in Maryland. And so this problem of how to become global by becoming local, universally local or local everywhere, by universalizing particularisms, not by spreading your own particularism and make it hegemonic, be global, which of course the second phase of globalization, the phase of Western European hegemony, which basically thinks that globalization means the westernization of the world. This is what comes after the Jesuits lose their model. So they are thrown out of every Catholic country, and even the Catholic rulers force the Pope to dissolve the order because they are too much global, too much transnational. They don't follow the notion of cuius regio eius religio and the notion of the absolutist state. So the model of globalization, the triumph, was the model of the Westphalian system. The globalization of the nation state that at the same time globalized capitalism. And you could say that part of the new age is one in which the whole model of the United Nations becomes weakened because new forms of image and communities emerge. And this is where also global denominationalism comes in. Benedict Anderson, the great theorist of modern nationalism, very clearly argued that the modern nation is an heir of both, of the sovereignty of the king and of the national church. It's a secularized monarchy or secularized sovereignty, we the people, we the nation, and it's a secularized church. The imagined community of the church becomes the imagined community of the nation. And for a while it seemed like the imagined community of the nation was going to be the global imagined community. There was very little room for other transnational imagined communities. What happens in the last 30, 40 years is the proliferation of new global imagined communities, which are linked to pre-national religious and civilizational identities. In this respect, Huntington was right, partly. The re-emergence of civilizational and world religion identities is key to modern processes. He's right. The problem is that he identifies these global identities with geopolitical territories. Doesn't realize that actually globalization leads to the deterritorialization of all imagined communities. And what you find is through diasporas, through mass media, through all kinds of exchanges, that these global imagined communities become more and more, again, virtual, global, deterritorialized imagined communities. And that's why they don't need to clash if they don't compete over territory. They clash when they compete over territory. If they can live together in global cities, they de facto do. If you go any global city today, from Singapore to Johannesburg, from Sao Paulo to New York, from London to, let's say, Istanbul, a little less, you will find precisely all global religions living together as part of this globalization of diasporas and religious flows and imagined communities. This is also the great, probably, problem of sociological theories of modernization, that were linked to theories of the transition from community, Gemeinschaft, to Gesellschaft. And the argument was, there is no room for community in the modern Gesellschaft, and the modern urban city is the model of Gesellschaft. And so the European experience was, as the French famous Catholic sociologist, Lebras, pointed out in the 40s and the 50s, the moment a peasant from Bretagne sets foot in La Gare de Montparnasse in Paris, he ceases being Catholic. So going to the city and leaving religion behind was one and the same thing. So it was understood that urbanization leads almost naturally to secularization in Europe. But of course the experience in America was that people became more religious when they came to the urban centers. The same Italian peasants from the Mezzogiorno that went to Torino and Milan and lost their religion and became anarchists and socialists, went to Catholic Argentina and lost their religion and became anarchists and socialists, came to Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Chicago, and they became for the first time Catholics here. And the experience of America, that people became more religious the longer they were in this country, after having been urban immigrants, was of course the experience that now is an experience which is repeating itself throughout global cities today. Global cities everywhere today are centers of religious innovation, religious transformation, religious, basically, ferment. Unlike, of course, the urban centers of Europe, that were indeed centers of secularity, because as people left the territorial parish, they didn't have a way of joining voluntary religious congregations, because the model of the church was a territorial one, both of the nation and of the territorial parish, while the model of congregations or religious communities everywhere today is the modern voluntary associations, which are not Gemeinschaft in the traditional sense, but are really very modern forms of community. Now, poverty. How do you get poverty into here? Poverty, of course, is a very interesting question. On the one hand, you could argue one of the axial prophets were all both denouncers or renouncers. Denouncers of the abuse of the rulers and of the powerful to protect the widow and the orphans and the meek. So basically the religion or the ethics of the axial age of all these laws are very much humanitarian, of equalizing, and of critique of the powers, especially to desacralize the power of kings and the power of the lords, to give sovereignty to some kind of transcendent power, to God, to the sacred. So the sacred, the immanent sacred, the preaxial sacred is immanent. You have the sacred kings, sacred cities, and so on. And now you desacralize this power for the sake of a higher power, be it the God of Israel, be it a Platonic idea, be it a Confucian principle of Tao, or being a Buddha renouncing all the world and everything in it. So it was very much linked also to an argument of renunciation, and as Taylor would put it, beyond human flourishing. They all offer paths of salvation, which are paths of renunciation of what could be called success in the world, offering a higher form of life, which is usually understood as otherworldly. It's a higher form of being human than simply being immanent human. But of course we know that with modernity, immanence comes back, and it's very difficult to look for a transcendent principle within immanence. This is the whole argument of Taylor's secular age. What we must understand from Taylor's thesis, again, I would argue that what it shows is precisely the globalization of the immanent frame, of a cosmic order governed by science and technology, a social order organized through horizontal, humanly constructed societies of democratic states, civil societies, and mediatic public spheres, and a moral order of the self-evident truths, of the rights of individuals, inalienable rights of individuals to life, liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, while the axial religions very often bless the poor, it's been a model of a higher form of religion. Most immanent principles of utilitarian ethics are based on the principle of happiness, pursuit of happiness, the pleasure principle, and obviously they do not valorize poverty very much. So the question is really to which extent in our global age the tensions between liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness are such that religious traditions still argue precisely for the principle of equality in the sense of the global humanity and the dignity of each human person, and the extent to which this becomes a key transformation to criticize what otherwise appears to be natural processes of globalization. So I mentioned before the Jesuits as a model of globalization before European hegemony, because it is linked to a theory of multiple modernities, a decenter war in which there is no center and periphery, but actually precisely a globe in which there are no centers, there is a fundamental equality between cultures and religions, and a fundamental sacralization of human rights. So the fundamental question here is about poverty has to do both to which extent all the religious traditions, which always had a very, very strong sacralization of the poor, precisely is a way of showing the solidarity and the obligation of fraternity and compassion and charity. Basically, this is what it is. The fundamental obligations of the three great universal religions are based charity on the one hand, agape, basically the almsgivings, and basically the solidarity with all your brothers and sisters, a fundamental equality of believers before God, and God is the merciful, and God is the one that helps the widow and the meek and the poor, and the one that puts down the powerful. And to which extent those messages can be transformed, still make living traditions that become ways of mobilizing against what could be called the effects of inequality that very clearly go with globalization. And here, of course, we have a mixed bag. You could say the Catholic Church that for about the last 30, 40 years was a very, very powerful voice. Not against globalization, because a church that calls itself Catholic, which means global, means you cannot be against globalization, but only against a particular form of globalization. So they offer a Catholic model of globalization against neoliberal economic globalization. Islam is a global religion claims to be global, the religion for global humanity, therefore cannot be against globalization. Only they claim they have a better model of how we could become a global humanity than this one that has been imposed upon us by Western colonialism, and so on. So the condition we find ourselves in the same way you find global denominationalism, you find competing universalisms, competing models of globalization, competing cosmopolitanisms, if you wish. And so the question is to which extent those religious traditions have the force to at least ameliorate, probably not to develop alternatives, because ultimately the triumph of economic globalization and media and technological globalization is such, and still the power of states, particularly not all states, not the United Nations, but certainly the most powerful states, which still claims national sovereignty over international law. Those are still very powerful forces, and I don't think there is any religion today that has the power to counter-rest. But on the other hand, if you look around the world and look for NGOs committed to issues of, again, charity, poverty, the Jesuit refugee service, AIDS, against AIDS, evangelicals, you have a lot of religious people there, but not only religious, you have a lot of secular humanists there. So the argument is the notion that somehow it's either religion or not religion probably is not the right argument. The question is, of course, to which extent even secular humanism, as Taylor argues, is based on basically secularized form of agape. Certainly our Western humanism is a form of agape. Humanism itself could never translate itself into a question of solidarity unless it was linked to some form of moral obligation towards the other, which has, of course, a religious source originally. But doesn't leave any more of this religious source. You have a lot of really solidarious people which are secular, not religious. The notion that somehow we need religions either for solidarity or for global humanism, of course, is not the right answer. On the other hand, I think there is an element in which the sacralization of human rights leads to a condition in which the religions compete also to become the carriers or the ones that define these human rights in their own terms. And one of the most interesting arguments today that we see around the world, around many of these global, let's say, contestations, has to do not so much religious versus secular, but the religious sacred versus the secular sacred. And here again, I have not mentioned the notion of the sacred. We talk of the category of religion, of course. Religion means every possible thing today, precisely because, as I said, once you have this immanent frame that allows individuals to define what religion is. But then, of course, we know even from the sociology of religion, the very two radical opposite foundations we have, the Durkheimian foundation, that defines religion as the collective sacred, and argues that everything that is individual is magic, has nothing to do with religion. While the whole Bavarian tradition, in William James, of course, argued that religion is only this kind of individual relationship of the person and some kind of supernatural being having to do with the particular individual relation to the transcendence. Those are two conceptions that sometimes come together but sometimes are radically separated. And today you have, I would argue, today what you find around the world is simultaneously an ongoing secularization, which comes through the secularization of the immanent frame, all three, the cosmic order, the social order, the moral order, function increasingly as if God would not exist. Etsi Deus non daretur. And therefore those are truly secular institutions. Modern science everywhere in the world, modern capitalism, the modern state, modern media, and even the claims of the individual rights ultimately are purely secular, or they can be. But then, of course, this is connected with all possibilities of very different religious dynamics within the same immanent frame. And then you have the process of sacralization of human rights. In this respect, probably Durkheim was right. He was the one that argued the cult of the individual is going to become the religion of modernity. And what we see as the globalization of sacred human rights is a confirmation of Durkheimian theory. But of course, he was wrong thinking the old gods will die and new gods will be born. No, the old gods have been reborn by becoming the carriers of sacred human rights of individuals. So we see the popes that for 150 years condemn the discourse of human rights as secular, as against the church, have become, of course, the great carriers of the discourse of human rights around the world. So you have today a very interesting dynamics of the interconnection of secularization, religious transformations of all kinds, and sacralization of individual, of the human dignity of the human person, if you wish. And so it's not post-secularization, it's not either religion or the secular, it's all in complex processes through globalization. And again, the question is whether this has anything to do with poverty and the resistance to poverty, or to the resistance of the struggle, the way in which globalization continues to produce inequality and then enters into real conflict with the fundamental religious tenets of charity, of equality, of brotherhood, of humanity. This is an open empirical question. I am optimistic. I see a lot of religious people dedicated to these causes, but I see also a lot of churches that are not particularly. Even the Catholic Church, that had taken the social teachings very much as a core of its confessional identity for decades, today is much less relevant. Issues of gender and sexual morality are much more the core of the confessional identity of the church today than the social teachings. So I'm not going to say that we see very clearly a kind of religious resistance against unequal globalization. Sometimes, yes. Frequently, yes. But not always. So,
we've got some time for questions. Feel free to pose your question directly to Casanova.
please.
I mean, I have a question. When you talk about Europe, after Europe, it's interesting to hear where you say that the European reaction is that people have sort of what's called rejected Christianity because it was forced upon them. But is the consequence of that when people get over this counter-reaction, that they can rediscover religion? Because now that's probably what's going on, because they can finally be free, but
well, there's the thing one would expect, and this was the argument of the supply-side theory of religion, that secularization was a consequence of church hegemony. But once you bring pluralism, then you are going to have people becoming religious again. But there is very little evidence of that. So the question is, are we still so secular that we are not yet post-secular? So the question is, have we already adapted? I come from Spain. In Spain, we are still becoming secular. We want to be so secular that the notion of becoming religious is simply nonsense. What is clear is very little religious conversion in Europe. But the only movement is from the church out. No movement going into small minorities. So there is, in the new generations, you see some search, some opening to transcendence, spirituality, certainly not institutional religion. There's very little opening to conversion to formal institutional religions. And we don't know, interestingly enough, the competition from the new immigrant religions, which is the dynamic, comes from that. It is the dynamic between immigrant religions and then globalization, where Europeans view themselves not anymore as the model of the world to come, that we are simply ahead of everybody, everybody will become like us, but they have reflected, well, no, the whole world is becoming modern, but they're not becoming like us. So to which extent our secularity is the natural thing because we are modern, or we reflect upon it? I think that only in the last decade you see those beginning debates. But I think that the fact is that most European countries still have the notion that the true religion is your national church. And you leave the church and you don't go for other religions. You are either within your national church or simply you are non-religious and you remain post-Lutheran, post-Catholic, post-Calvinist. Unlike here in the United States, where you see, according to the last Pew survey, almost 30% of adults claim to have changed their religion from childhood. And this meaning not from Protestant to other Protestant denominations. If you include Protestant denominations, switching, it comes to 40-somewhat%. So the notion of people changing their religious affiliation, one of every third adult, is unthinkable in Europe and unthinkable in many other parts of the world. In India, it's also unthinkable for completely opposite reasons. So it will take a much more, I don't have any prediction, but I don't see any evidence yet.
Mm-hmm. One of the more, attention-grabbing trends in America is the rise of the religious nuns.
Yeah, right.
And a lot of the scholarship is saying that it's really more of a diffuse personal spirituality. But your talks have been focusing on the Catholic Church, which is highly organized and highly institutionalized. And so it looks like these are sort of two different approaches to religiosity. How do you see these two strategies kind of playing out in a global context?
I mean, basically, I do take it as a very serious new trend. It's not, I think that for the first time we are seeing a serious new trend of non-affiliation in the United States, and which is not anymore linked to simply youth cohorts. And the question is, how do we explain it? Do we explain it as finally, American finally is becoming secular like Europe, confirming secularization? Or do we simply, as a historical explanation of the experience, phenomenological experience of people who are fed up with the culture wars, the way the churches, not only the Catholic Church, but the churches have behaved politically? This would be the Putnam explanation, a kind of a reaction against institutional involvement in politics. And in the same way that everybody is fed up with politics, the more the churches get involved in politics, the more fed up young people become with it. It's a very simple explanation. As to what does the nuns mean, again, we don't have, I would argue probably of the 18 to 20%, I would argue 1/3 will be hardcore secularists, agnostics, atheists. Probably 1/3 will be the spiritual, not religious, which in itself is a very interesting category, which is not by any means so large in Europe. And 1/3 probably will be the unclear, they go here and there, but they have no affiliation whatsoever. So I am still, because the belief in God has basically not changed. So it is affiliation that has changed, non-affiliation. But if you wish, in terms of the, because in Europe you really have decade by decade a growth in the people that do not believe in God and that basically do not pray, do not have while in America those things, I mean affiliation, but again, still we are talking of 80% of the population, which is still a very, very high, unusually high that you would not expect in any normal society. So even those levels are, I would argue, extremely high, and how far it will go, I really don't know. So yes, you could argue that the United States always was defined by a lot of individualized form of religion that happened also outside of the institutional churches. This was already throughout the 19th century. You already have, you could argue, the Bernover district, all the kind of movements from the 1840s following the Second Great Awakening, but also the kind of experiments, interest in spiritism, occultism, and all kinds of masonry and Swedenborgian. I mean, William James, ultimately, at the time when he wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, he was already talking of religious experience, individual, non-institutional form of religious experience being characteristic of the United States. You could argue that the really consolidation of denominational churches was a post-World War II phenomenon, and that now is loosening up partly for all kinds of reasons. But I'm not expert so much on, as Mark said, on data, real data counting this. No, because there is the question is how do you interpret those things? I still is is a really important new development, and the question is how do we interpret it? Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
In one of the articles that the class that's present read of yours today, you talk about you come kind of to narrating the history of American religious history. You come to the kind of George W. Bush years, and you mentioned that a plurality of moral voices, religious and non, are needed. I think the implication is that.
Well, this is very interesting because when I wrote this article, it was when I wrote even my thesis of the three processes of disestablishment of American Protestantism. The first one, the establishment of the Protestant churches, which led to religious pluralism, the Free Exercise Clause. The second, disestablishment of the hegemony of Protestantism in the American mind, and basically secularization of the universities, if you wish, and secularization of public discourse. And the third, the secularization of the Protestant ethic that comes with the countercultural and moral pluralism. So religious pluralism, ideological cultural pluralism, moral pluralism. And each, of course, each of these disestablishment has led to a fundamentalist Protestant reaction to try to reestablish. So in '78, the famous historian of awakenings, McLaughlin, asked the question, well, we certainly are in a process of kind of the fifth awakening, he said. And the question is, what is going to be the new? And he's basically arguing a new president is going to come that is going to basically create a kind of a new discourse of a new American civil religion, which is going to be more transnational, less chauvinistic, more socialist, and more, I don't remember, basically. Obviously, Reagan came, and Reagan was completely the opposite. And for 20 years, it looked like the moral majority was really gaining ground, and certainly not. So this time, it seemed the fundamentalist reaction against the disestablishment was succeeding. My argument would be that now we see the evidence from the last 6 years with the election of Reagan. We were discussing this over lunch today. I see very clearly a new realignment of a new moral majority around the Democratic Party, if you wish, which is a much more multicultural, more international, more certainly gendered and more female and more... and it is this kind more multiracial, multi-ethnic, and that basically puts into question the claim of the Christian right to represent the moral majority. So the argument would be, again, at least it's clear that there is something to be said about this being in flux, and that the Obama administration can be said to be both a symbol of this realignment. And I was saying that if you look at his inaugural speeches, which are the ones that define the American civil religion, following Bella, then obviously his first speech, the key sentence was adding to Protestants, Catholic, and Jews, Muslim, Hindus, and non-believers for the first time. Not only religious, but non-believers were part of the American civil religion. And in the last one, of course, was linking Selma, Seneca Falls, and Stonewalls as a kind of realization of the self-evident truths of our creed, of the founding fathers. So linking this not as a fall in morality, but a realization of the American moral values. And if this argument continues, at least for, it was very important, I would argue, that the fact that in the last two presidential elections, it was the Democrats that used a religious discourse, while McCain, for whatever reason, did not use any religious discourse, and Romney this time, because of his own Mormon identity, could not use confidently a religious discourse. So whether this is only a temporary thing or it's a sign of a new realignment, we'll have to wait.
How would you project that globally?
Well, globally, I would argue, obviously, multiculturalism is here to stay, the recognition of the irremediable plurality of humanity. The interesting thing about the axial age is not so much the simultaneity that those people, Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, and the Old Testament, are contemporaries. This is interesting. But really, the interesting thing is that when it happens, the global consciousness, it comes in 4 radically different versions. So you have universalism, yes, but 4 different types. And I guess the more our global condition to this, the recognition of the irremediable plurality. So we all are universalists, but we are very differently universal. We are all cosmopolitans. We try to be, but we have very different models of cosmopolitanism. And I think that we are more and more open to the notion that simply we are not going to become more alike. We are going to, the only way of being both accepting pluralism is if we accept, of course, the fundamental sacred human rights. So this is the condition within which then pluralism is possible, of course. But
in this context of global
denominationalism, yes.
What's the place for those religious expressions that don't want to be reduced to another denomination between denominations? Because it seems to me that a lot of times in defense of the truth of every religion, we become really full of hatred and we become enemies of some religious expressions. Exactly because we say they don't recognize this rarity.
No, this is a very, I don't think that we are there yet by any means. We, as I said, recognition, this is a very, I mean, even the Hegelian sense of the recognition of the master and slave, it's a bloody process. And we sometimes gain through recognition after bloody conflicts. And as I said, the sacred and secular. I mean, if you look at many of the debates, contestation that takes place in the global public sphere of media and so on, it is not so much, basically, we secular Europeans against religious fanatics. It's basically we secular Europeans that for whom the freedom of expression is a sacred value that we are willing to defend, and these Muslims that put the sacred prophet. And so it's sacred against sacred. And when you have then European journals, newspapers, that republish the caricatures as a form of sacralizing our freedom of religion, it's a way of precisely. So in this respect, obviously, as opposed to the American newspapers, not because they produce self-censorship, not to irritate. So it's not because you cave in, but because simply you realize that there are elements of, that when you use blasphemy against your own God, you have the right. Because basically, ultimately, if it is your God and you blaspheme, then, whether you get retribution or not is up to God. But if you make fun of somebody who is not your God, you are making fun of the other person, not of the God. So it's a way of not recognizing that. So what I'm saying is, in our modern context, the notion that only truth has rights, while false ideas have no rights, which was, of course, a traditional Catholic position. Only truth has rights, error has no rights. As opposed to the notion that, no, we don't know. Ultimately, you have to let truth and errors together, and false and true religions be together. So there is, I think, an element, but it's very difficult, certainly for homogeneous cultures, religions, in which it was taken for granted that this was the only religion, and you don't accept heretics within your midst. You can accept better the other, totally other religion than your own heretics, right? And so it is ultimately the recognition of pluralism within, which is really the issue. Once you recognize pluralism within, you recognize pluralism without. To recognize pluralism without is easier than to recognize pluralism within. And so this is probably where we're struggling today around the world.
We'll take one more question. Well, we'll take two. Okay. Maybe I'll ask a question. It seems that throughout you're pushing against the post-secular. It seems that you're resisting the category, the post-secular. But most of the presentation was to show that what we have is not the secular, except in some places, or the way it is now. It's everything but the way we imagined the secular before.
Right.
So what is at stake for you in not using the term the post-secular?
I'm using the term post-secular, but I'm not using the term post-secularization. So for me, post-secular means post-secularist, that you abandon a philosophy of history that claims the secular is what comes after religion. Because religion is not yet fully modern, the secular is what is modern. And so the argument that the secular is what comes after religion is what I disagree. So I challenge the theory of modernization. The modernization leads to the secular. And I argue, yes, we are in a post-secular condition, the precise condition of pluralism, in which to be religious or secular are options. So I'm also against the post-secularist reaffirmation of religion in the sense that religion is universal, societies need religion to be moral, humans are homo religion. No, my argument is our condition is truly of a secular age, as Taylor has pointed out, the global condition of pluralism, which is both all forms of religious pluralism competing, but also non-religious pluralism, forms of non-religious worldviews competing with one another. So this is what means post-secular. Post-secularist, so a self-conscious reflexive notion that to be secular doesn't mean to be post-religious, but what actually meant seculum first when Augustine used the concept. The seculum is a theological category and is a temporal space between now and the parousia, the second coming of Christ, in which both Christians and pagans have to work together within the civic space, although, of course, what is sacred for me is profane for the other and vice versa. So we don't agree on the sacred and profane, but we have to agree that we are all in the same seculum, the same civic space, and we have to work together. So this is a conception of secular, which was the original one of Augustine. Later, of course, the secular becomes the other of the religious monastic order. And so it is this dualism of the religious monastic and the people living in the seculum, which is a radical dichotomy, from which then the European process of secularization proceeds. My argument is we are already in a secular age, and this is the argument of Taylor. We don't need any more, so we may need a theory of disenchantment, we may need a theory of secularization to explain how we have constructed an immanent frame. But once we have the immanent frame, it's precisely the frame that allows all forms of religion and secularities to coexist. And this is for me what a post-secular condition is, not post-secularization. It's not that people are becoming religious again. I don't see that much evidence in the heavily secularized societies that people are becoming religious again. But they themselves have to challenge their own conception of themselves as being somehow higher form of humanity than the religious people who are not there yet. So it's the challenge in the philosophy of history that puts secularity in a stage higher than religion, which I argue for, that means post-secular.
Please help me to thank Professor Casanova.